Hello, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am.
Hello, good evening.
पप्पा जी आवाज ना करो छो Yes. So we are live. I think we can begin the session. Nidhi, can you please start?
Yes, sure. A very warm good evening again to all. In this session, we are having a lecture by Professor Uma Chakravarti, renowned feminist, historian, writer, and filmmaker, and a former professor, Miranda House College, University of Delhi. And the title of her talk is Rewriting Women's Histories, Challenging Existing Paradigms and Shifting Perspectives. I warmly welcome you to this session, ma'am. It's a privilege to have you in this webinar. I also welcome our honorary president, Dr. Nandal Shastri sir, and I also welcome President of the History Enthusiast Association, Miss Manali Momaya. Last but not the least, I welcome all the participants who are joining us through this session. Now, I request Miss Manali Momaya to introduce Professor Uma Chakravarti.
Thank you, Nidhi, for the welcome. I'm extremely thankful. First of all, I want to say this to Professor Uma Chakravarti, ma'am, for accepting our invitation and being here with us today on this occasion. Uh, Professor Chakravarti is a scholar who probably needs no introduction. We all know her. We are infant researchers in front of her, and we get nourishment from her works and thoughts. So, but if I have to, I'll briefly introduce her. Professor Uma Chakravarti is a distinguished Indian feminist historian who has taught at Miranda House College for Women, Delhi University from 1966 to 1988. She has worked extensively on Buddhism, early Indian history, the 19th century history, and contemporary issues. Since the 1970s, Professor Chakravarti is associated with the women's movement and the movement for democratic rights. Uh, she she participated in several fact-finding teams to investigate human rights violations, communal riots, and state repression. In her most recent work, she has directed two films. One on the life of a child bride Subbalakshmi, who went on to participate in the Indian independence movement, and the second on the writer Maithili Shivaraman, who worked with laboring men and women, documenting their oppressions. Uh, Jawaharlal Nehru University historian Professor Kumkum Roy has edited a volume of scholarly essays in Professor Chakravarti's honor, stating that she had inspired generations of teachers, students, and friends. And this could not be better stated than this. Professor Ashley Tellis from City University of New York adds that she had a profound influence on the lives and careers of scores of young scholars and activists, playing the role of a founding mother of Indian feminist history writing as well as the Indian women's movement. There are, I want to quote the names of the films: A Quiet Little Entry, Fragments of a Past, Ek Inkilab Aur Aya, Lucknow 1920 to 1949, and Prison Diaries. All these focusing, among other things, on stories of women. So I think we could not find a better speaker for this webinar, and we are so lucky to have ma'am here with us today. Without any further ado, I give up the stage to Professor Chakravarti to deliver her lecture on rewriting women's histories, challenging existing paradigms, and shifting perspectives. Thank you for this opportunity.
Um, Thank you, Manali. That's very generous of you. I was fortunate to to be able to join the session in the morning, your inaugural session where Professor Goldman delivered his lecture, and Professor Bandyopadhyay, I think his name was, who also, and I thought to myself, this is good because they actually dealt with the the textual positions. Now, that is one way in which you can look at the question of gender. But I think from my point of view, what is useful is that I have also looked at texts, but as a historian, I'm actually interested in a larger set of questions which sometimes the texts do not address. The texts are written for different purposes. So they don't actually give us a sense of the diachronic nature of society and changes that are happening in it. There's you take a text and the text is kind of frozen to a particular time, and you read it from internally, from the point of view of being able to analyze it. You can do very fine work on it. And one of my forthcoming books is going to be on the Mahabharata. It is called The Dying Lineage, but I'm interested in a feminist question. So in a sense, I'll be doing something that Indologists and Sanskritists and so on do, but I will bring feminist questions to it. I want to today focus on how we finally, over a, one of the things we started off with, and I've had a long career of teaching and researching. One of the first challenges that we had to meet was to deal with the way in which questions of gender, and especially early Indian history were cast, tended to be from a sort of idealized, constructed framework in which the binary of the past and the present was constantly present. So, for instance, it was natural for us to do that, because in the 19th century, when historical writing started, and when questions started to be examined, there was a particular way in which the archive, the historian's archive, was mined, was looked at from the point of view of its material. But the framework that was used was a somewhat narrow one. We were still under colonial rule at that stage, and there was a tendency for us to, and being under colonial rule meant that we were not thinking on the ground for ourselves, but we were forced to address questions which the colonial powers were, our writers, were charging us with. So this whole trope of the status of women is very bad all over the world, but particularly in South Asia, and it's the West that has actually managed to, in a sense, liberate women. Now, this freedom, this notion of West and East are constantly playing in the 19th century, at the back of the 19th century thinker. And so the men who start to examine history and start to write it, they write about the status of women in early times, and they tend to write it in a very glorified way. So there is a tendency to say the status of women was very good. And the figures that they picked out were Gargi, Maitreyi, and these were made to stand for the whole of society. Now, I understand why it was done, but that's not the whole of society, and there is a problem with that. And it's also limited, because beyond a point, we have to address our questions. And it's important for us to remember that we have to address our questions according to the issues that we feel concerned about. I'm not interested any longer in what the British thought, or what what the West thought about us. I'm interested in how we ourselves look at our past and look at the textual sources to mine them from the point of view of trying to understand the nature of Indian society and the manner in which the gender question appears over there. So writing women's history means, first of all, to be able to drop the biases that are existing in society, ask questions and ask questions from a feminist, humanist, equalitarian paradigm. From my point of view, it's not a, feminists are one part of the move for a changed way of looking at society in which everyone's history is important. We are not only interested in the kings, we are interested actually in the ordinary individuals, and women are among the quote unquote ordinary individuals. So in a sense, I think that was the first challenge. Now this challenge came out of, and the need to look at early Indian history came from a basic thrust which was happening on the ground. The women's movement starting off from late 70s, early 80s, was confronted with this question of extreme violence against women, which you could find in various spheres, including the family. So the family, dowry violence had to be addressed. Now, at that point of time, young women who were battling this monster of violence against women, and we all think that we were all grew up with the idea that the family is the site of protection for looking after nurturing people. In reality, we started seeing a very extreme form of violence against women in the form of dowry murders. That led one young woman to come to me and at a demonstration, and she said to me, "Ma'am, you just don't come to demonstrations anymore. You please go and tell us, read the text. You are an early Indian historian. You are a historian of early India. You go and look at the text and tell us what there is in our culture which says that when a girl is married, she goes away to her husband's house. She must never come back to it. And a lot of it is that now the South is better in a lot of ways. The North does have this culture of sending a girl away and then not having much to do with her and so on. So this agony with which this girl started off is what precipitated my own writing on questions and an interesting analysis, an interesting point that I'd like to just mention. This morning, the Ramayana was coming up, other texts were coming up, Professor Goldman was talking about all of that. In a strange way, the first essay I wrote after this girl said, with great pain, which she asked me to go back, is an essay that I wrote on the Ramayana, on Sita. I don't call it the Ramayana. In this context, I'll call it the Sitayana, because the Sita story, as it emerges across various versions of the Ramayana, is what I started to look at. And it was fascinating because the story itself developed over a period of time. So one of the things that one was forced to look at is the narratives and mythologies are not static. They come, they are developed, and they grow over a period of time, So, and they change. But the direction in which the change occurs might decide how strong that influence is. There's no doubt that the mythology of Sita as the pure Pativrata woman is now the only way we remember Sita. But actually in the narratives, it's so wide-ranging. The text shows multiple ways in which the story of the Ramayana grew over a period of time. So actually that was now. But what was so we were exploring why is it that women suffer oppression? Why do they not speak up? Why do they not resist the oppression and so on? And so the mythology was useful. But after a while, that was not useful to us. We had to move to looking at history from a more concerted point of view, which is to say, how is what was actually the evidence that we had on history, and what are the different types of locations in which you find women, and their histories are not similar. So one of the important things is that there are these mythical characters, and they are very powerful in socializing people. But what is the kind of range that we get about ordinary women? How are we going to write the history? How are we going to write the history of the past as well as history of the present? From the point of view of a genuinely gender inclusive point of view. So so then I wrote a long, that led me to explore the question of why were we so fixated with what is called the Aryan woman. We started write all our writing, especially in the 19th century, was about, as I said, this Gargi, Maitreyi, and so on. Why were we so narrowly fixated over that? And you could see that it was part of this desire, this attempt to tell the story, tell a story to your people in order to enhance their own self-image. We needed to be told that we had a rich history in the past, and the situation with the gender contradictions were not there in the early stages and so on. But so I wrote a long essay. Some of you may have read it. It's called "Whatever Happened to the Vedic Dasi," and it was an essay that came out of my looking at the 19th century writers on early India. So this attempt to say that actually women are not of just one kind; they are distributed across class and caste and so on in different locations. Some of them labor outside, some of them labor only at home. Some of them are, belong to rich households, princely households. Some of them belong to working class locations and so on. So, in a sense, you had to rethink the manner in which we were saying the Aryan woman or the ancient Indian woman. These would be ways you would have to disaggregate that and break it down to different categories of people that you would get references to. And there is evidence in the sources to give us something of a history of all these people. Now, the tendency for us, and it's natural, we write our own history as a people, our class, our region, there's a natural affiliation. Those of you who are practicing history in Karnataka will obviously want to do something which speaks to your social experience, your history. And there will be a tendency for you maybe to think of writing. It's very important. It's very important to do that history because we need to have the diversity of historical experience also to be mapped. But we also sometimes tend to look at ourselves through the narrow prism of our own social location. So, depending upon where you're located, and the first generation of educated men and women tended to come from the uppermost castes. Okay, so they didn't actually when they the perspective that they would bring to their writing tend to be from the narrower standpoint of ourselves. And I'll give you the example of widowhood. Now, widowhood was flattened to mean widowhood was a terrible condition, and it was very repressive. All of that. Now, I'm not going to deny that. Those of you who are in Karnataka, you might have read a novel by M.K. Indira. Not a novel. It's based on her grandmother. I think it's based on her own grandmother's story called Funny Amma. Funny Amma's account is a very moving account of a widow. I think she lives in at the turn of the century, 1910, 12, or whatever it is. And it's a very fine, very moving sort of biographical account of her grandmother. Now, absolutely correct. Okay, no doubt about it. But the upper caste widows' life was really miserable. It was, you were expected to, especially in early times, you have to shave off your head. You wore a sari, which was defining your ascetic status, non-sexual status, and the whole thing was about controlling the widow's sexuality, and even Faniyama's own life is very interesting because she's forced to be not have any sexual relations, but later on she discovers something like somebody in her family is having a illicit, quote unquote, illicit relationship, and she's like, oh, this is what it's all about. I don't want to have anything to do with it. It's very interesting that in the novel itself, in the work itself, that's not her pain, but her pain, and she's treated very well by her family. But it is very interesting, the narrowness of the social class to which you belong also means that you tend to look at the whole of society from that point of view. Now, you shave off the hair, you can't wear the clothes of a certain kind, and even Faniyama, over a period of time, she eats less and less. Finally, she eats only 2 bananas a day, and at some point, she even gives that up because there is some little squabble between the children, and she thinks, what should I do with even this? So it's like, but she's fantastic, and yet she is very humane, very human. This account of the widow is a biographical account of the widow, is very full of feeling, and of course, there's no doubt that she could not be remarried. She had to live a life which was in retreat, and all that was there. But that was not the only thing that was happening to the widow. Okay, so and this was only for the upper caste widow. Lower caste widows did not experience that form of ignominy which others did. So you actually had to start off thinking. Some of us had to rethink the question of caste and status, caste and social experience, caste and the history of women. So the history of upper caste women was very different from the history of middle caste women and the history of lower caste women. So, all of these things began to happen, and our work began to be refined. So the questions that we were asking and our analysis became more and more sophisticated and better from the point of view approaching history as it should be seen, or history as the evidence itself showed you. Okay, so that was a very interesting moment. Now, a real critical moment comes in our. So the point is that the Brahmin widow was not the only paradigm. Did they have access to property or not, and whatever. And you found as you went into other castes that there were actually very different ways in which the relationship to widowhood was negotiated. I'm using the example of widowhood because most feminist history will have dealt with widowhood at some point of time or the other. Okay, so but we really need to go beyond that. And what is interesting is that from about the 19th century onward, when you start looking at the corpus, and you had to expand your sources. So very fine collection was put together by two scholars called Lalita and Tharu. Susie Tharu and Lalita, I think you may have read it. It's called Women Writing in India. And it's a fantastic source book of the kinds of things that women have written right from early times. Okay, so for instance, I was asked to translate some of the Buddhist bhikkhunis' writings, their verses, and so 4 of those form part of it. And we found that actually there is a history that you can write of women which goes back to very early times. So the 6th century BC, there are these women. They are initially they're not allowed into the sangha, into the monastery, but then they argue and they fight. And there's very, very powerful account of how they argue and how they come into the sangha. And the whole move to see the struggle of women to not be limited in terms of the social roles that they've been given. So here is, and the case is argued by Buddha's own foster mother. She's the one who comes in and says she should join the sangha, and these women should join the sangha. So they struggle, they get in, and then they leave amazing poetry behind. The Therikatha is absolutely fantastic evidence of the range of social experiences that the women talk about. So among their poetry is very interesting. They speak against domestic drudgery. They actually speak about the fact that, I don't want a life in which I'm only grinding using the mortar, pestle in the mortar to grind corn and whatever it is. I want to achieve the liberation goals, So you see that whatever may have been the vision of society for women, women had a different vision for themselves, and they struggled to achieve that situation. So it's quite a moving account. But there's also other kinds of moving ways in which they speak. Now, it's very rare to hear anyone talk about death. But the bhikkhunis talk about death because many of them talk about the loss of children. And some of the most moving poetry comes out of that. I don't know if you people know this, but there's this very moving story of a woman who loses all members of her family, and then there's a child that is left, and that child also dies, and she's very she's crazed with grief, and she is going around like a mad woman. And some kindly person says to her, "Go and see the Buddha." So she goes to see the Buddha, and the Buddha realizes that she will not stay. You can't tell her anything quote unquote rational. So he tells her this moving story of go and get me a handful of rye, sarson, a mustard seed, and bring it back to me. And she goes from one house to another, and by the time she reaches the end of the village, she realizes she's already started off on the path to liberation. Because one of the things that you understand is that if you're born, you will die. Death is as natural as life is. So now that's such a moving account, and you get this also in the textual corpus. So our texts are, if you explore them, you get a wide range of issues. So it's not only about who's a widow, who's not a widow, who's whatever it is. I think at the end of the day, there is a very rich way in which you can try and access the past. And so, that kind of stuff started to get written. Now, all of this was early work. But as I said, one of the limitations of this early work is it's still focused around what the texts think is important to record. Okay. Now, there are certain structural biases in that. So, the voices of ordinary people are not going to get into it. It's a tough one. It's a very difficult one. But other than that, there's also some questions start to emerge. And it is the 19th century where the feminist, let's say, critique of society begins to emerge. And it comes when women get access to education. So let's leave the Maitreyi Gargi debate behind and see what is it that by the 19th century, nobody is studying. The girls are not going to school. It's very restricted. And while their husbands get access to English education in the uppermost caste, the girls don't have any access to education. In that situation, people who Jyotiba Phule opens a school for girls in 1848, and his wife Savitribai is a teacher in that school. And there's a young girl called Muktabai Salve, who actually writes an essay. That essay was printed in some missionary journal. It's a very moving essay in which she talks about the oppression that the Dalit woman the Dalit child, Dalit girl, Dalit woman is going to face. So there's actually, you move away from the most uppermost caste, and your frame moves to include women from other sections of society. And so this essay that she writes, it is so full of anguish and pain that she doesn't even complete it. But it's a very powerful account. Savitribai Phule herself writes a story. She writes a set of, she writes poetry, she writes a few essays, She's a teacher in that school. So there's this new dimension. She, along with Fatima Sheikh, are running that school. So there's a new dynamic that is emerging in the middle of the 19th century. And as part of that whole phenomenon, you get this wonderful critical polemic long essay written by Tarabai Shinde, which is that the comparison, Sri Purusha Tulna, the comparison between men and women, and she attacks the hypocrisy of men who are changing themselves, but they're leaving their wives, and they continue to think the most negative things about women. And it's a very angry piece of writing. It was so angry that people said, who's this woman? What does she know? And so on. And only Phule was left to defend her because it is a very angry piece of writing. But the point I think that's important for us to recognize is that from the 19th century onwards, the women get access to the learning. Sometimes they get it because their husbands want them to be educated, and so that they can, have a nice relationship with them, discuss Shakespeare and whatever it is. There are some examples of that kind also. Or they just want them to be socially matching their status because they're all moving in society, upwardly mobile they are. But equally there are, the fact is, and so they want their wives to be educated, so they say, I can't live with this woman because she's like a stone. And as if to say it's her problem that she's like a stone, they made her into a stone, by denying her access to education. So anyway, they start to read and write and whatever it is. Once they learn to read and write, then they take off. Even sometimes their husbands tell them, start, you start with me learn. Once they start to write, they write whatever they feel like writing. And so then actually you look at their autobiographies are very rich in terms of describing their own situation. So there's a very moving autobiography by a woman called Rashasundari Devi in Bengal, and she writes about her. She's a very ordinary woman. She learns to read because she is a devotee of the Bhagavad, the Chaitanya Bhagavad, and she wants to read it. So she reads secretly to start with, because the men don't like her to. Finally, she gets to a point where it's known that she's taught herself how to read and write, and then she writes her autobiography. Now, the autobiography is a very interesting piece of writing because she's not radical at all. She's not saying, great, whatever it is. But she, in describing the ordinariness of a woman's life, the daily drudge, she actually shows you how. So in passing, she describes, she bore 17 children, okay, in her life. Yeah. And then she describes how, she describes how one time she didn't have time to sit and eat. Not that she was fasting. She didn't have time to sit and eat for 72 hours. For 72 hours, she gets no time because the children are crying, the kitchen has to be managed, the husband is calling out to her for this or that or the other. She doesn't get time to eat. She doesn't say this in some grumpy way, she just writes it. She writes it in a very casual way. It's like a fact of life that she puts in over there. She's not actually challenging society. She's simply stating a fact of life. But we can read that. And when we read it, we can see what she's saying. And then she has a lovely take at the end. She's saying, people say this is Kali Yuga. And obviously Kali Yuga is a bad time, but she says, blessed Kali Yuga, when girls can go to school. Now here's a self-taught woman. And she's saying, blessed. So you see that when women are finally able to read and write and use the pen, and the printing press is available now for them to be able to speak to a larger audience. So you write and publish and then it circulates. So the similar ideas start to circulate. So the 19th century is a very powerful moment when you shift the focus and women start to speak on their own. But then, even then, there is a certain limitation in the way you are, whatever. So if you look at it from the point of view of the task of the historian at that point of time is to slowly, step by step, rewrite the ways in which we think about our past. We think the way we want to speak about our past. We have new ways of, better ways, more sympathetic and sensitive ways. And we are not interested in telling a simple story of glory. We are actually saying, okay, what was it really like? And you use the sources from that point of view. And so better history started to emerge. We still were faced with a situation where we didn't confront the structure of oppressive ideas. I want to just get to, in this last bit, I want to refer to the fact that I should take only 2 minutes because I'm running out of time. At some point, this need to write something analytical from a very feminist point of view about caste and gender and the fact that they work together in a certain kind of way. Okay? So that's something that came up. And so then I wrote this essay of mine, which was called Conceptualizing Brahmanical Patriarchy, which circulates quite widely. But at the same time, I also wrote other things. And I want to stress that here, and I'm only representative of many other kind of, everybody is doing that kind of thing. So I wrote an essay on the woman devotee. It was called the Bhaktin and I took 4 characters. I took Avayar, Andal, Akkamahadevi, and Karakalaya Ammayar. They're all from the south. One from Karnataka, that is Akkamahadevi, and the others are from the Tamil space. And again, it was very interesting to examine what they said about the mythology around them. So one of the things that became evident is that the male bhakta, he does whatever he feels like. He can manage both house and God. So you can proceed. They continue to do their work. They don't have to split themselves. In the case of the woman, she couldn't actually reconcile the devotion to the husband with the devotion to the Lord. There was a conflict of interest. And in all of those cases, I noticed that they resolved the contradiction by somehow surmounting their sexually active years. So Avayar moves from being a young girl to an old woman. The mythology tells us that she went from being a young woman to an old woman. And so there is a very interesting way in which the experience of even something like devotional can be marked by the contradiction. Akkamahadevi is supposed to have been married at some point, and then she walked out of the marriage. So she set some conditions, and the king whom she married did not follow them. So she left the household, and then she walked, in the way she wanted to, freely exploring her own self and her relationship to the divine. So in a sense, you can see the same material, these texts have existed. This knowledge has existed. You have to just change you have to be sensitive to the perspective of women, and you can tell a completely different line of thinking and a different line of analysis. And that makes it richer from our own history. We can relate to this history better because we're not being fixed into categories of, you keep saying puja papa to your husband or whatever it is, and that's all that there is in history. But actually, history is full of so much evidence of how women struggled to claim space for themselves. They did not want to be left behind in any kind of move, whether it was to devotion, whether it was in other forms of ways. So this is some of the journey that one tried to take. They're all part of it. Will always be, you are all familiar with the fact that they will always cite these examples, how wonderful Akkamahadevi was. But the fact is that you may not understand necessarily the power of what she's trying to do and the arguments and whatever it is. It's a very rich life. And I think that's, quite powerful. So there's a lot that we can do in recovering our history and telling a feminist history, even if you're doing the past and not the present. If you're doing the present, your sources are much better. And if you're doing the 19th century or the 20th century, sources are much better. It's much tougher for us, those of us who are stuck in the pre-modern times, to be able to write. But even we have found a way to crack it and write the way we would like to write, so that it's a genuinely gender inclusive history. I'm sorry it took. But we should have a round of questions if they are.
Absolutely, ma'am. It is so inspiring, the way you have laid out the points so far. It reminds me, the last few points that you mentioned, it reminds me of a poem by Kishwar Nahid. The grass is really
Yeah.
like me. Uh, Even though, as you said, there are evidences of women struggling throughout the history. It is not
Yeah.
like they were always submissive and always obedient.
Hmm.
Even if they were trampled upon, they tried
Hmm.
in one or the other way to come up, to grow, and to show what they are to the
Yeah,
world.
yeah, 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 yeah.
It is absolutely a very, very inspiring lecture, ma'am. I'm really grateful to you. There are a couple of questions in the chat box, and I think there might
Okay.
be more.
Yeah.
Dr. Korobi Mitra, there's a question from her. Madam, I wanted to know, how do we explore the history of women of Shudra Varna?
Yeah. You see, one of the things that I learned from a feminist historian called Gerda Lerner was that, you see, the texts are not good. Now, Shudra Varna, today we can go into field work. Okay, if you're studying Shudra Varna, women from the Shudra Varna, today you might have a better, first you can do field work. Secondly, if you're going back into the 19th century, maybe there is textual evidence in newspapers and places, in the archive. There is a legal archive. There's a fair amount of material in the legal archive. It may not be there in the newspapers, but it will be there in the legal archive. The legal archive is a very important space in which there's a famous essay written by Ranjit Guha, which is called Chandra's Death. It's about a widow who, she still belongs, she's not Brahmin. She's from a lower order, but widows are not meant to be sexually active, and she's pregnant, and her sister and her mother do an abortion for her, and she dies. Then it becomes a legal case, okay, and it's a very moving case that they have. So you will find it. It's a tough job, because if I'm writing sociology, I can go and do it. But if I'm doing history, then I have to go to the archive, and the archive may give you stuff, but it may not give you stuff. But you have to extract it in whatever way you are. When I was stuck with my early texts, one of the things I was told by Gerda Lerner was to say, look at the time in which the new rules are coming into existence, and you explore why suddenly are they saying a woman must be dependent first on her husband, first on her father, then on her husband, and then on her son. Why do they need to say it? Because they were not already in that position. So it's women's challenge to their lives that leads to the negative rules that fall upon them, because there's a tendency to force rules upon them. So in a sense, even the law can be looked at, and why is that law available? Why does it happen? You have to examine. You read from the counter. You read from below. You have a critical oppositional view. Why are they doing this? Why are these new rules coming into existence? So that's one way you can do it. But the fact of the matter is that it will be, but you get a clue from it. Lower orders means all men from the lower castes, and women are particularly threatening to the social order. because this is Brahmanism trying to control everything else. So actually, you have to be creative in the reading of the material and examining it in a certain kind of way. Or for instance, now, even in the Vedic text, they say you get the black woman for pleasure. Now, very instrumental. And then there all sorts of explanations are given saying that the woman who is, why did women lose, and this is the finest thinkers are using arguments like this, why did the women lose their right to participate in the ritual? One chap turns around and says it is because the men, they are acknowledging that the Aryan men had wives from the lower orders, not from amongst the Aryan women. It would be the equivalent of what became the Shudra afterwards, okay? And in order to deprive, and she brought up with her a certain inability to speak the mantras and so. This is look at the bias in the formulation, and so they deny her. All women are denied. Even the Aryan wife is denied education. Now this is a ridiculous argument, okay? But it's very typical. It's coming from the brain of a man who's trying to protect the social, the bias and the social thinking. So, in a sense, what I'm saying is that you'll have to work hard to find the evidence. It might be little in the evidence, but then it's like this story of Chandra's death. It's in the legal archive. You find it and you stumble upon it, and then you actually examine what is happening. Maybe it's there in the British ethnographers, Risley and so on, talking about different castes. You'll find the evidence in different places, and it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge, but then that's a challenge we must accept and pursue.
Absolutely, ma'am. And as you said, oftentimes it happens that when we try to write something from a feminist standpoint, the men, the scholars, they try to become defensive as if we are attacking them.
Yeah.
Whereas we are actually attacking the evils that are there. And feminism is nothing but a part of humanism. So I think.
Absolutely.
Yes, ma'am.
Absolutely.
There's another question here by Shri Nandan Shastri sir. Umaji, in context of existing paradigms and shifting perspectives, how do you perceive social urban strata in India in context of a couple in live-in relationship? I think it's about the women's sexuality and the freedom of.
One of the things is that social. One must also see at what stage is this live-in relationship coming up. It's a very interesting phenomenon. It's a good question, very good question. But let's also be historical. So we don't have formally announced live-in relationships in the 19th century. There may have been live-in relationships even at that time, but policing was very strong. Very strong ways in which you could police the behavior of men and women. Post explosion, and it is really very much in neoliberalism has come into existence. Women are now working, and women have agency of a kind that they did not have before. Okay, you can't enter a live-in relationship unless and break from parents. Unless you are got some kind of autonomy in terms of your own capacity to survive, economically survive, and then you will choose to do whatever it is. It also has to do with behavioral rules are not free floating. Okay, they are actually relating to multiple changes that are happening in society. And the rules are shifting. There was a time when you would have to hide. The girl would have to hide her relationship. The boys may have been able to. I mean, you may not have had living relationship, but there have been a lot of, let's say, premarital relationships that happened, and I know this was quite the common. But living relationships become possible at a later point of time. They are deferring, partly they are deferring marriage, partly they are not, they are escaping from And marriage itself is something that we've had to, and should be, it should not be a prison house, for either men or for women. If there's a democratic situation, then you have to be responsible, and you have to be responsible to children, and you have to be responsible to each other. But at the end of the day, there's no reason why you can't out. So divorce and remarriage and parental custody of children, the whole situation is now changing. It's happening for a very small class, very tiny fraction. Okay, we've given it a lot of excitement because it's going to court these days sometimes, and it's full. The media is filled with stuff, but it's a very minuscule proportion. By and large, in India, that's a very small, and it is possible, as I said, only for in urban areas, only for a certain class of people in which women have got some kind of economic agency, which makes it possible for them to negotiate their own lives in a certain kind of way. Because it's the opposite of, I was constantly being told by my students saying how their parents are forcing them to get married. They are trained, they are highly trained, and then they'll say marriage. And the argument that the parents are using is to say biological clock is ticking. So having a child according to a certain age is the most critical thing at the moment. So these girls, poor things, are trapped. I mean, partly they have PhDs, they are highly qualified and so on, and then there is this thing. In a live-in relationship, actually, marriage and reproduction is being sidestepped. They're not going in for it straight away. Ultimately, the live-in couple may decide to get married also. Because property relations will always determine that if it's a stable live-in relationship, at some point they'll settle it in some way. But up until the time that they're not sure, they're leaving it open and fluid, And this is a phenomenon that is happening at this point of time. So let's look at it historically. History is diachronic. It's changing all the time. Rules are changing, customs are changing, everything is changing. And we have to ensure that it is not loaded against women. Nothing should be done which is loaded against women. And if they're, so I would look at it like that.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I want to ask a question from my side. So we saw that the paradigms have shifted. There is a shifting perspective of looking at the issues of women. But in the real condition of the lives of women, especially the rural women, how much has actually really changed?
Yeah.
So that's my question. Like, what is there any real change, or is there still the same thing going on?
To women, before you can shake up that traditional system, and in rural areas where you have, one thing about rural areas is that there are common law relationships and common law ways of negotiating, which are not necessarily the kind of thing that middle class and then upper classes do. Okay, there's some fluidity in according to caste and according to class that happens. So we can't say rural areas is only one kind of situation is happening. But by and large, women's sexuality is policed and very powerfully policed. Okay, so it isn't as if say there's much agency that women have, too much agency that they have, and they are not working outside of the familial structure. So there's very little that they can do to exit, say, an oppressive situation. So I think that the rural areas, they have their own systems of dealing with certain, and we cannot flatten them out. Every region is not the same thing. But you can also see that things are changing even there. I mean, girls are seeking to be educated. The cycle, the great cycle revolution is happening. Look at the girls and what they're wearing now. I mean, I was always struck by the fact that you go into the rural areas in Karnataka today, and you will find even the woman who's looking after sheep and goats, she's taking them out. She's wearing a maxi. She's not wearing pavade and dhavani. No, she's wearing a maxi. Why? Because it's so convenient. It's so cheap. you buy one for 100 rupees and you can put it on. And it looks a little bit like a power air, so it's all right. What's the big deal? So actually, so much change is happening. We are fixed on certain kinds of things. But I think women are resting space for themselves and arguing and trying to recover some of the agency that they had lost traditionally. So I think it's an exciting time to be looking at women. You can't any longer force them to be Sati Savitri and sort of moan and groan and weep and so on. No, I mean I think that things are changing. That too is happening, but this too is happening. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Absolutely, more power to women and more power to humanity.
And I want to you said Kishwar Nahid. I want to tell you one little thing. I was at a poets conference in Lahore one time, and she was there. And she read a beautiful poem. She's well known for that Hum Gunegar Aurtein. But she read a poem which was on Malala, because Malala was being castigated at that time. And she said, it begins with, Wo jo ladki se bhi dar gaye. So it was very interesting. She was challenging these men who are so scared of a girl getting educated. Kya baat hai yaar? That's a question. That is what they would like to freeze you. So that's very interesting. Okay.
That definitely shows.
Ma'am, I have a small question.
Please go ahead.
Ma'am, in Rigvedic age, there was matriarchal society, and in later Vedic age, it suddenly transited as a patriarchal society. What was the cause for this change in the society?
Well, this is not correct representation also. There was never a matriarchal society. Okay. Acha, we must also understand what do you mean by matriarchy. Matriarchy is a mirror image of patriarchy. That's a women in power, and everything according to the woman's she's lineage. It's matrilineal is different from matriarchy. Okay. We've not had historically that society for a very long time. In fact, Rigvedic society was quite patriarchal, very patriarchal, because it was still full of tribal social organization. And tribal social organization, warring groups, continuous warfare, and so on, cannot give you high status of women. It cannot actually. So we have to understand who has what power. Yes, at a time when there is no formal education, when there's no, it's only oral poetry, then women are in a position to compose. Just as, to this day, oral history is very important. Remember that. Oral history is one source. You can go back and talk. You can study history from this generation, remembering their grandmother and great grandmothers, in some way. So you'll find that kind of a difference between a static society and a dynamic society. It's changing, and the direction in which it's changing. Sometimes the customs are quite offensive throughout the world. Let's be very clear. Patriarchy is not a phenomenon of only India or South Asia. Across the world, we had unfair property systems, unfair marriage systems, and there was foot binding in China. There was whatever it is. Only tribal societies have a slightly better status for women, because in a tribal society, the hierarchies have not been so frozen. So I think that actually, and then you will find that the social organization will adapt itself to the stage of society. Okay, so when you settle down in the large tracts of land and you begin to do agriculture, and you intensively get your food not from cattle, not from, but from your growing food, your social organizations will change. Everything will change, to some extent. So I think one has to be actually keep the training of the mind is very important. The questions that we ask is very important. And then you have to read the evidence the way you can, as much and as well as you can. Okay.
Thank you so much, ma'am. With your
Thank you.
permission, there's one last question in the comment section. Can I take it up?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, requesting the audience, this will be the last question. As you know, history has been also a power centric. Like history has been power centric. So my question is, how to know
Yeah.
the history of women of powerful people, community, and caste or class? Because women from this class were hardly accessible to everyone. This is by Dr. Kushal Singh.
See, this is absolutely true. The relationship between history and power has been so close historically. Okay, so our early thinkers are why. Who are the people who are deciding things? You take a man like Ashoka. Okay, Ashoka leaves behind inscriptions. He's talking about himself. He's talking about I think Ashoka is a very interesting figure. But the fact is that he has the what's it called, the capacity to marshal resources and to tell his story. Okay, his story is about speaking to people, but it's also about other things. It's also about ensuring that there is no schism within the Buddhist order. Multiple things that he's talking about. He's also sending out messages saying, "Don't do this, don't do this," and so on. So the relationship, and the first inscription, who leaves the record behind? The ordinary person is just living his or her life. They have no access to writing their sources, getting into the sources. We have to find. We've already talked about it. How do you find them? How do you find the Shudra woman and the Shudra woman? I mean, the whole process is very complicated. Yeah. So, in a sense, the unfortunate part of history was that it was told as a story of power. And that's the most unfortunate thing about it, because it erased whole sections of human beings out of it. But even there, even in the Ashokan inscriptions, there is stuff on the Dasakarmakaras. He says, so he mentions the category of Dasakarmakaras. So it is a story of power. It is a story of how he is speaking to his people, what he thinks, what he doesn't, whatever it is, what he's exhorting them to do. But in the process, he talks about also other categories of people. So in some ways, even as you rule, you will have to deal with the sections that are ruled. That brings us the story of who is subject to power. So the story is not only about power, but it's also the story of wielding power and experiencing power, as you may see. So I think that the terrible thing about history writing in the past has been fixation with wars, fixation with kings, and fixation with people who did everything they could possibly do to get to power. Okay, but that's not different from power. Let's also forget, the story of power is actually quite complicated. It is not the story only of the king. It's the story of most sections of people and how they relate to the king, to the experience of power in their own times. You can see, for example, you've just been through an election, today, and you're getting the news. I mean, everybody's involved in actually combating the notion of power. You can't do certain things, you can do certain things, you have to go according to constitution, you have to go. It's all political in one sense, but it's also very social and economic and so on in another sense. So I think that even as it's narrowly told as kings, now we don't fortunately do that. We don't do just the history of kings. But there is a tendency, look at the newspaper, even today, the front page will always be the peer. Poor ordinary human beings will come on page 3, page 6. Only if he dies, it will come. It will come otherwise. Someone dies of starvation, death, it will come. Other than that, these guys are sitting on top, of They are the ones who are dominating. So this story, this is the bias that we have of not only history, but the way we tell our own stories even at this point in time. But by and large, what do I have to do with it except for the fact that sometimes they can club me in jail or put something else? Other than that, what do I have to do with this story of power? Yeah. So I think that there's this fixation of history with power is one of the worst things but it has been broken, and now people are telling the story of those who experience power. So the feminists are telling the story of the way in which women have experienced power. Dalits will tell it as how have Dalits experienced power. So I think we are opening up the space for discussion. Yeah.
Absolutely, ma'am. As you said earlier, we were looking at individuals who were in power, and now we are looking at those two things separately and connecting them with each other. So it has opened up many new perspectives of study and to look at things in the past.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. It has been a really interesting and thought-provoking session so far. We have absolutely learned a lot from you, ma'am, and there's still a lot to learn from you, but as time does not permit us to continue today, I think we will have to come to an end of this session. And from the bottom of my heart, on behalf of my entire team, I want to propose a vote of thanks. I want to express my gratitude to you, ma'am, Professor Uma Chakravarti, ma'am, on behalf of all the participants in this session. Ms. Nidhi Katti, the Vice President of the History Enthusiasts, Sri Nandan Shastri sir, our Honorary President, all our executive team members. Thank you very much for spending your valuable time and sharing your knowledge with us, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the title you've given yourself, the History Enthusiasts.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
That's great.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Bye-bye.
Bye, ma'am. Thank you so much again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yes. I also want to thank the participants who have patiently listened to the lecture and also participated very actively in the question and answer session. I also want to thank our Honorary President Nandan Shastri sir for joining us in this session. All the senior professors, all the scholars from various parts of the country. We have come to the end of today's sessions. The day one of Itihasa Saptaha 3.0 has been very successful, with a few minor technical glitches here and there. We will definitely work on improving that in tomorrow's sessions. See you all tomorrow at 4:30 in the next session. That will be by Professor Sharda Srinivasan. It's an interesting topic. We will be sharing the link and the brochure, etc., in the group. Stay tuned. And last but not the least, I want to thank my dearest friend, Ms. Nidhi Katti. Thank you all once again. Good night. Shubhratri.